Welcome to all of you. Good afternoon. My name is Ron Osberg. I'm the chair of the Alumni Council, and I did graduate in '68, but I lost my name tag already. I guess what accrues, one of the great benefits of being the chair of the Alumni Council is you get to introduce the dean. And I want to say a couple of things about him that many of you may not be as aware of because you're not around as much. Not only, in my opinion, is he a master of running this institution, which is increasingly complex because our professions become increasingly complex, but he is, from my perspective, thinking of what the alumni need and want and how they can support the school. He's been a wonderful master of that as well, and extremely supportive of the things that we're trying to do in support of him and in support of students. The third area in which he is quite a master, and those of you who have seen him perform in this role as the taking the bully pulpit of this institution out to the rest of the university, and the genuine respect and affection that he has gained from the president, will realize how good a job he is doing in leveraging the world of design into this incredible institution that we're all a part of. It's with great respect and great admiration that I introduce to you our Dean. Moisen, thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you, Ron, members of the Alumni Council. Ron has done such an incredible job over the short period that he's been leading that particular group to really create an incredible sense of energy and connectedness. I'm also deeply grateful to all of you for being here and for your participation in the 75th anniversary of the GSD. I am also extremely grateful to Harry Cobb and the panel that will continue after my short presentation or comments. I think it's a really wonderful moment in terms of the history of the school. We are blessed to have an incredible group of wonderful students, an incredible group of alumni, and an incredible faculty and staff. And these are not easy times, but it's very important for me to say that we really have an amazing team of people, and it's only with their help, with their support, and with the way that we're working together that I think we will be able to achieve some things in the coming years. The 75th anniversary of the school is a very important moment. Many of you heard Peter Christensen's description of the exhibition and the way in which the exhibition was constructed, not as a chronological project or presentation, but really as a series of themes, of issues that were important, that have been important in terms of the history of the school. There are many, many other themes that we could have and we probably should have added to the exhibition, but given the space, given the clarity of the exhibition also as a project, I think Peter, our exhibition team, the students who did the research, the staff who did such an incredible job, I think put together a really amazing exhibition that in many ways manages to capture both part of the history of the school's achievements and many of its current concerns. As you have noticed, the panels above the display units are really presenting many of the thoughts that are very much current in the school under the auspices of dispatches. We are fully aware of the fact that the idea of developing a thematic exhibition is also a way for us to be aware of our own current position in relation to the production of the making of future events, thoughts, ideas in reflection. So in some ways, it's very important for us to be within the present, but at the same time, see the present as a historical project. And in that sense, what we are doing at the school is both a project of continuity, but it's also a project of distinction. It should be, in some ways, continuous, but at the same time, it should be distinct in terms of how certain things are different than maybe some of the things that have been done in the past. Harry and the group will, I'm sure, discuss the lineage and the history of the school, but in many respects, I find myself in many ways very much in tune with some of the ideas that Dean Hadnot wanted to introduce here in the school, which is really the idea of the formation of the Graduate School of Design 75 years ago as a school that brought together a variety of different disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and city planning at that time. And of course, subsequently, with José Luis Sert, that we had the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Urban Design Program, the formation of the Urban Design Program, and subsequently in the 1980s, under the leadership of Jerry McHugh, the MDesS programs. And of course, we have our doctoral programs. The school, of course, the history of the GSD goes back much further than 75 years. And in a way, it's important to not forget that, not to think that the GSD, in some ways, within the history of GSD, there's also a much older history, going back to the 19th century with the formation of architecture as a department, as a program, and landscape architecture, and of course, city planning in the late 20s. So when I say that we are in some ways reflecting on the ideas of Hadnot, is that there is a moment in the history of the school where it's very clear that there are a variety of different disciplines and professions of architecture, landscape architecture, and city planning. But at the same time, there is a clear mission, a clear desire to bring those disciplines together under one roof of the Graduate School of Design, and to argue that in fact it's the collaborative nature of those disciplines together that provides, as Drew quoted from Hadnot, this idea of really the transformative or the notion of improving human societies and improving human environments. I think in many respects that mission hasn't changed very much. It's very much that kind of project. The question is, how do we achieve that today as opposed to how it was being addressed in the 1930s? I think it's also clear that when we think about the history of the school, we are often reminded of a link to European modernism, as well as a direct link to an earlier version of American modernism that had been embedded in the development of the aspirations of architecture or landscape architecture here in the school. The combination of that American modernism and European modernism and the debates and disagreements that happened in the 30s and 40s, I think we also have some of those things today. If you want to make a new school in some ways, if you want to make a school that is relevant, it's important to create an environment where people can really speak freely and can agree and disagree about things. One of the main challenges today for us in the school is really how to preserve the autonomy, the singularity of the various disciplines that are in place in our school, and at the same time to set up certain frameworks, certain parameters that actually enables the cross-fertilization of ideas across different disciplines without it undermining, in fact, the value and the importance of the disciplines themselves. This is a big problem. It's actually not a very easy thing to achieve, because the moment you try to develop collaborative projects, there will be moments when you have to sacrifice certain issues related to the development of that project of singularity of specific disciplines. And so one of the great sort of it's very, very direct, but one of the issues that I think we're facing today is really how to deal with that. How to deal with that in terms of our pedagogy, how to deal with that in terms of our practices, how to deal with that in terms of the research. And that's something that I would really love to discuss with you if we have the opportunity later on this afternoon. We have tried in the past few years since I've been on board to create a situation where we can really speak about the project of the school being a project which is about pedagogy, about research, and about practice. I would argue that probably until recently, the concept of research is something that has primarily existed in the work of our students and in the work of our faculty, in the sense that our faculty do their research and our students are doing research projects. But one of the things that I have been speaking about more and more is really the concept of the researches of the institution, that also the GSD as an institution has the responsibility to create and construct its own domain of research and investigation. This is a different way of working than the way in which, for example, individual faculty develop their work and write their books, or our own students do their research and write their dissertations or do their thesis work and so on and so forth. It is to really argue that we have the responsibility together to decide that there are certain things that we will work on together, and that we will not do everything, but that we will have a certain set of things that we will work together. Trying to decide what that is, the agreement on those things, again, it's really develops to certain conditions of conflict and disagreement. There won't be somehow automatic agreement what those things should be. But one of the things that I think we have tried to do is to use certain terms not dissimilar to those of Hadnat by speaking, for example, about the concept of engaging societies through design excellence, or the concepts of design innovation, better futures, as topics of complementarity between social engagement and design in some way that, in my opinion, is different than the project of the 1930s and the 1940s, when, especially after the war, there was really a great deal of pressure on social development, institution building. I think we're also arguing for the way in which the project of architecture, the project of landscape architecture, is now formulated in ways that the notions, such as the political, are actually embedded within the project of design themselves. So it is not simply that our hospital buildings or school buildings are symbolic representations of our commitment to social well-being, but it is to argue, and that the best example of that, for example, is housing, where housing has come to represent, in a way, the notion of social good or commitment to the social, but to actually argue for the way in which a new version, if you like, of residential building or housing could itself, within itself, involve spatial conditions that, in some ways, enable or encourage democratic procedures in ways that perhaps some of the examples that we have inherited from housing projects have not always been doing that because they focused on the singularity of housing as a social project. So I think these are points to, in a sense, discuss and debate how the project of design, how the project of architecture, in a way, engages with the political differently than the version of institution building which we've inherited since then. Anyway, there is not a huge amount of time, but I think that the main point that I want to emphasize is that given what I said before about this relationship between pedagogy, research, and practice, our main task in many ways has been to try and develop the GSD as a place that's really involved with research in ways that's different than probably the last 10 or 15 years from my perspective. In order to do that, we have tried to link the departments together more. We have created a concept called the concept of platforms, where various areas of teaching, such as history and theory of architecture, practice, technology, are both taught within the departmental context, and at the same time, the platforms are really going across the different departments and enable people to actually work together on those themes across the different departments. We have created the concept of research labs where faculty and students from different parts of the school actually work on projects that are part of what I was saying earlier, which is really the researches of the institution. So, for example, we have groups that are working on responsive environments, people who are working on sustainable design, people who are working on new kinds of geographies. All of these domains basically give us the opportunity to both work in our own disciplines, but at the same time to connect. And people actually working in designated spaces. For example, we have created this space on the 5th floor where people from different parts of the school sit next to each other and work on these kinds of topics. So in some ways, what I'd like to, in the little time that I have, I'd like to emphasize is this idea about a kind of large-scale vision, if you like, of the status and role of the school in terms of its work within itself, in relation to the rest of the university and in relation to contemporary practice, and really the notion of a kind of pragmatism that is necessary in terms of the implementation of specific ideas, projects, in order to realize those things. And I can describe, and we can discuss later on, how best to achieve some of these kind of larger scale projects. As Ron said, one of our main tasks has been the connection with the rest of the university. For the last many years, we have been seen to be a school, and most of the professional schools have been seen in that way, that we are really a silo. We are focusing too much on what we do within the institution, and that we are focusing on the profession. I certainly don't want to de-emphasize the value, the importance, and the quality of our professional project. This is something that we have to be the best at. But at the same time, it is really necessary for us to benefit from this wider relationship with this incredible research university that we have. And therefore, we've tried to also find ways, very direct ways, to work with the rest of the university. For example, at Harvard now, there is the Wyss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering. We have many different kinds of projects with the business school, collaborative studio model work, a project that works on design and entrepreneurship, the real estate initiative that in many ways is shared between the business school and the GSD. So we have to really look at ways in which we connect with the rest of the university, with the humanities, with engineering, with the Kennedy School of Government, and so on. And in order to achieve those things, we often need very specific catalysts again. The way we've tried to do that very directly is through the formation of a whole host of new Master of Design Studies programs. And these programs, as I said, they were initiated in the 80s. And initially, people basically took classes from each department and created their own track within the MDesS. we realized recently that in some ways we have to now change that formulation and actually use the benefits, the kind of nimbleness of the MDesS program to not only enable the students the freedom to take the classes that they want across the different disciplines, but to actually be able to now create new tracks, new areas that give us a direct engagement with societal issues that we feel our role can be extremely transformative. So, for example, we have started a program called Art, Design, and the Public Domain, and tried to get the GSD under the rubric of its role as a graduate school of design to also connect with the arts more broadly and see how artists and designers can really intervene in the public domain, and to have those people actually work with our own faculty and students within the departmental structure to move forward. We have created a program called Anticipatory Spatial Practices that looks at the role of design and planning in relation to risk and risk mitigation. And of course, when we're dealing with questions of anticipating disaster, we also have to work with the business school, with the School of Public Health, with the Kennedy School in terms of issues of governance and so on. I believe very strongly that these kinds of programs actually are already having an impact in terms of how we're also discussing issues within the rest of the school in terms of the departmental structure. Of course, always the challenge is going to be the challenge that I said at the beginning, which is the benefits of collaboration and in a sense, teamwork versus the idea of what we can achieve in terms of the individual departments and the way in which we can push the development and articulation of knowledge within each department. And I think that is really the main problematic in some way that we have to deal with. But I think it's a really positive theme for us to work on. In addition to working with the rest of the university, it's also really critical for us to work with undergraduates. And we all know that the university had an undergraduate program until maybe not so long ago, and then the formation of VES was really thought to take that idea much further, and unfortunately it's gone the other way, because there is almost no E left in VES. What was visual and environmental studies, there's very little environmental. It's basically visual studies and mainly kind of theoretical, and the degree of art practice for undergraduates. So we've been very involved with trying to promote, if you like, graduate education in the arts, and also to see ways in which the GSD can play an important role in terms of undergraduate education. We're hoping that as of the fall of the next academic year, there will be a dozen honors students who will be able to participate in an architecture concentration here at Harvard, and we are actually going through the final approval stages. This is something that we are doing together with the Department of History of Art and Architecture, as well as some level of collaboration with VES. So I think that will be a very exciting thing when we can really bring undergraduates back here to the GSD and have them participate in some of our classes and courses, which I think would be very exciting. So all in all, in some ways, I think what is important is really how to make the GSD relevant, both in a sense at a global level and at the university level. And the GSD has always had, of course, that reputation of being an international school. The whole link to modernism and the international style has been there. The reality now is that our engagement globally is something that cannot be simply limited to the aspirations of modernism. So we really have to figure out other ways of engaging with societies globally. So what we have done over the past many years, the school has always had a very strong program of travel and what we call sponsored studios, where the students really travel to different parts of the world. What is new now is that we have decided that we really need to, in addition to going to many places for a week or 10 days, that we should really have a kind of systematic, repeated relationship with many places. So we are not only then, and this is something that, for example, is very, very much happening in different parts of the school. We are not only working thematically, but we are also very aware of the kind of the geographic connections that we have with different places like China, India, Africa, Latin America, and so on. And we have now started the first program of actually sending a dozen graduate students this semester to Europe. They're in Paris for the whole semester, and we are not only providing studio experience, we are also providing courses. So they have really the full semester in that place. Next semester, we are sending 12 students to Tokyo to work with the Japanese architect Toyo Ito on the tsunami-hit region. And so that, for me, for example, is a perfect example of how the students will be working with a world-ranking architect in terms of quality of design, but at the same time, they will be engaged with issues that really are about societal transformation and the idea of developing a certain sense of engagement. That is something that's very strong in the school at the moment. The students are really enthusiastic about the idea of being engaged, and the concept of activism, whether it's in planning or architecture or landscape architecture, is a key part of this. The issue is how to develop these themes and at the same time really stay focused on the disciplinary issues that have to do, for example, with questions about the advancement of form, discussions around form in relation to technology, and how do we begin to develop new mechanisms of imagination and imagining, and not to really lose sight of the importance and value of creativity and imagining and its relationship really to the notion of social betterment. There's a lot more to be said and a lot more to be described, but perhaps this just gives you a little bit of a sense of a kind of big, huge challenges that we are facing today. But of course, maybe later on, if you are interested, be happy to discuss any of these things in more detail. I am very happy that the presentations, in a way, this afternoon will give us a bigger or a more in-depth context with the panel. And of course, that panel will enable time for discussions, and then there will be later on the Pachacucha presentations of some of the students and faculty, which will hopefully make the afternoon exciting and meaningful. So once again, thank you all very much for being here, and we really look forward to receiving your thoughts, guidance, advice. One of the key things about a day like this is that we should really get as much feedback from you in terms of what you feel are important and valuable things for us to be engaged with. So we really appreciate hearing from you. So I am very happy and honored to be able to invite Harry Cobb to come and deliver his keynote lecture of the afternoon. Harry is really an amazing friend of the school. He has an incredible position, having gone to Harvard College, having studied at the GSD, having taught here. He was the chairman of the Department of Architecture, and subsequently has stayed an incredible friend and mentor, in a way, of many of us and many of the faculty and many of the alumni of the school. So I think he has an incredible perspective, and of course, as do the other people on the panel. So please welcome Harry Cobb.
Thank you, Mohsen. Good afternoon, everyone. This is not a keynote and it's not a lecture, but it's remarks. And my remarks are introductory to remarks that we're going to hear from others who have agreed to join me later at the table. We've constructed this panel with the idea that we want to get a sense from people who were in the school in each of the decades, the last 7 decades, and who were in the school in the different departments to help sort of celebrate this occasion with a retrospective glance in a kind of balance to the inspiring prospective glance that Moisen has just given. I came this morning in time to sit in on some of the conversations with the chairs. Well, I sat in on a part of each conversation, and I was struck by the vitality, the energy, the aspirations that were being voiced for each department, for each program in the school. I have to say that when I walked in this morning, however, I was startled. I knew there would be an exhibition, but I didn't know that the centerpiece of the exhibition would be the red fist. The red fist rings a bell with me because I had the misfortune to be president of the GSD Association in 1969 when the red fist was invented, and when, as some of you know, a silkscreen press in the basement of Robinson Hall turned out thousands of T-shirts emblazoned with the red fist, the symbol of the revolution. It was a difficult moment. I recall that during the spring, summer, and fall of 1969, I participated in no less than 150 hours of meetings with students, faculty, and alumni. What I most remember about those meetings is that the word architecture was never uttered. The preoccupation of that moment was not architecture, nor landscape architecture, nor urban design and planning. The preoccupation were 2 things: governance and rights and responsibilities. There was actually a movement, if you can believe it, to write a constitution for the Graduate School of Design, as if we were some kind of third world nation suddenly emerging. A very strange moment. Anyway, my task as the introduction to this panel, and it is an introduction, is to start, go as far back as we can at this moment. We can't go back to the first decade of the school because there is nobody here to represent it. I represent the second decade, the decade of the 40s. There may be 1 or 2 people here who perhaps recall that era, but I pretty much have a clear field to make up whatever fiction I can think of, because nobody can give me the lie. But I'll try to be truthful. The only way I can be truthful at this moment with fading memories, and you all know that fading memories have an alarming capacity to turn into vivid myths. So I'm trying to do the best I can with fading memory, and I think, and I want all the participants to make this event. I hope we'll all have fun. I hope you'll have fun and the speakers will have fun. It's not too serious, but at the same time, we want to, in a certain sense, make this backward glance vivid. I'm going to, since I'm the first, I have the privilege of making my talk more digestible with images. And also since I'm talking about people that most of you never met, I think it might be useful to see Joseph Hudnut and Walter Gropius separately and together. Just this image tells you right away how extraordinarily different these characters were. Walter Gropius was charismatic. He came to the school as a recognized leader of the revolution, the modernist revolution in architecture, with the whole background of the Bauhaus behind him. Joseph Hudnut, I don't know what the opposite of charismatic is, but he was it. And of course, the result is that he was terribly neglected. It's only within the last few years that Jill Perlman has done him justice quite accurately and eloquently with her book about that era. But in my time at the school, we were here not because of Hudnut, we were here because of Gropius. But I learned a few things, and I'm going to focus on these two people and one other. I'm going to focus my recollections on them. Gropius was the reason I believe everyone in the school in that immediate post-war era were here. And it was an extraordinary time. You have to remember that in the years starting in 1945, most people in the school were returning from the war. In other words, they were returning from what was, to say the least, a maturing experience. I had spent the war years in training, and by the time my training was finished, the war was over. So I was young, inexperienced, and I was thrown into this extraordinary group of students. So for me, the school really was the students. And it wasn't just because the students were extraordinary. It was also, let's face it, because the faculty compared to today was relatively weak. And the strongest member of the faculty, Walter Gropius, was not present for most of us. And that lack of presence, which I resented, was, I didn't know it at the time, but it was owing to the split that occurred between him and Hudnut in the early 40s. And of course, I was in the school in the late 40s. That split that caused a kind of mutual alienation from which the school suffered greatly. Walter Gropius, for example, didn't attend a single review or class during my entire time at the school. I saw him only once. Heard him speak only once when he gave introductory remarks in my first year. I saw him for the second time when he attended my thesis review. In between, I never saw him. He was, of course, very present for his 15 master's students. But what had happened is that because, at least this is my interpretation, and I think it's true, that because of the disagreements, the growing disagreements between pedagogical and theoretical and philosophical between him and Hudnut, he retreated, so to speak, into his master's class and didn't have much to do with the rest of the school. And there were several bad results, consequences of that. For example, for one thing, Gropius was, of course, dedicated to his idea of basic design as an introductory course, an idea that he brought over from the Bauhaus, whether it was appropriate to graduate students at Harvard as opposed to very young people in the Bauhaus, that's another question. But the problem was that he insisted on it, and he won that battle. But he did not succeed in getting Hudnut to hire the people who were needed to teach that course. The result was that it was not well taught. A vivid example is Gropius for years tried to get Joseph Albers here. I just can't imagine my life would have been a different life if Joseph Albers had taught the basic design course here at the GSD. The other big issue, of course, in which Hadnot and Gropius seemed to agree but actually didn't, was the issue of history. And again, since there are a few others here from that era, I think it's important to remember that the pedagogy of the modern movement, as practiced by Gropius, sought to protect the student from contamination by all of history, so as to clear the way for what was intended to be an entirely new architecture, liberated from the tyranny of dead styles, in which art, technology, and social purpose would be powerfully joined for the benefit of humanity. This attitude toward history is elegantly summed up in one of Franz Kafka's most memorable aphorisms. The decisive moment in human history, he wrote, is a continuous one. Hence, those revolutionary movements that declare everything that came before them to be null and void are in the right, for nothing has happened. Now, that pretty much sums up the way that history was treated at the GSD. It's not that history wasn't available. You could go to the FOG and get courses from Kenneth Conant, but history was neglected. It was neglected because of a misunderstanding, if you will. Hadnot believed that that students should come to the GSD knowing history, that it was an essential element of one's liberal education. Gropius, on the other hand, had exactly the opposite view. He believed that students should not be exposed to history until they had begun to master the art and craft, begin to discover themselves as artists, if you will. So for two different reasons, history was excluded, or marginalized, I should say, from the school. Of course, later on, Hadnot's view changed radically, and it was undoubtedly because of his experience here that it changed. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But first, I want to point out that the Gropius era, in a certain sense, there was a cult of personality around Gropius. And that's one reason why those of us who were not in his master's class were so disappointed not to have contact with him. That cult of personality was most vividly kind of illustrated in an issue of L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui that appeared in 1950, which was edited with the assistance of Paul Rudolph, for example, and has many articles. It's essentially a hagiography of Gropius. An article by Siegfried Gideon, articles by Gropius, illustrations of his built works, photographs of Gropius as the teacher Godhead, Gropius and Isa Gropius in their house in Lincoln, student work, emphasizing the large-scale urban structural aspects of the student work, student theses, my own on the right, and Rick Franzen's, one of my close classmates, on the left. The student thesis of I.M. Pei, who was in Gropius's masterclass, was given 2 pages because Gropius especially admired it. So this was a very important publication, now of course only available in rare book collections, that in a sense summarized or tried to summarize Gropius as a teacher. There you can see that even the back cover of this magazine. Isn't it wonderful to think that a magazine could be published without an ad even on the back cover? It says Walter Gropius, the spread of an idea. In that whole issue, did the name Hudnut ever appear? No, certainly not. It was entirely about Gropius. And again, I want to emphasize that we were here because Gropius was here. And that brought this quite extraordinary group of students in the immediate post-war years to the GSD, and we essentially learned from each other. The faculty, compared to the faculty today, was nothing to write home about. Breuer, who had taught in the 40s, stopped teaching just when I arrived, so I never saw him. The best of our critics, truthfully, as in my recollection, was I.M. Pei, with whom, of course, I then formed an association. That's another story. So the record of history, the documentary history, is all on the side of Gropius and his school and the idea that he spread. The same year, or actually the previous year before that issue of L'Architecture d'Aujourd'hui appeared, a book was published, a collection of Hudnut's essays, and didn't attract much attention. I remember that I gave a copy of it to my mother for Christmas, and the reason I mentioned that is that it exemplifies something about Hudnut, which was that he wrote fluidly. Lewis Mumford says that he wrote with a witty and felicitous pen, and he wrote wittily and felicitously, so much so that I felt that this was a book that I could use to persuade my parents that it wasn't crazy of me to attempt to become an architect. Now, he was, now our contact, I've left something out which is really important, that although Hudnut was essentially a non-person as far as the GSD was concerned, he was, as far as the students were concerned, he was very much a person in one respect, and one respect only. And it didn't affect everyone, but it affected me and a few others. He taught a 2-semester course in civic design. Retrospectively, I wish, of course, I've never taken a note in my life, so I took no notes of him, but I wish I had, because it was a terrific course. Widely believed by people whose memory I trust better than mine to be the best course taught in the school in those years. It was a history of civic design from Greece to modern times. It was taught, by the way, not in the Department of Architecture, but in the Department of City and Regional Planning. From that, there are a few nuggets that I picked out of Hudnut's writing that will give you a sense of who he was and his thought. Nuggets which I appreciate now today than I did when I first read them. I have been surprised more than once in reading the history of cities to discover the evil which honorable men have wrought and the good which we owe to scoundrels. Cities are never static. When you touch a city, you must know its dynamic nature. You must be conscious of a growth and a becoming never ended, of something that is on its way, of something crowded with potentialities of change and surprise. Planning is one of the sweet uses of adversity. People plan when they see that something in their affairs is going wrong. When all is going well, they will leave the event to God. Well, even though it probably takes a little too much time, I'm going to quote from one paper, from one piece of writing by Hadnot, because it's what you have to know is that during the early years of the GSD, in the effort to bring together architecture, landscape architecture, and regional planning, city and regional planning, the real stumbling block was city and regional planning. Hadnot couldn't make that work. First of all, when he came in, there was a tenured professor who was dead set against him, against bringing city and regional planning into the school, against Gropius, against everything that Hadnot wanted to do. And so much so that Hadnot actually closed down the program of the department for a year or so. And it was a tremendous puzzle for him. It was extreme difficulty. That combined with the increasing difficulties he had in his partnership with Gropius, which by the late 40s had really reached a very difficult stage. All of this was behind the scenes for us as students, but retrospectively we can see that it's one of the reasons that the school programmatically, truthfully, as a teaching program and as an enterprise of scholarship, it was a weak place. It's a much better place today. So this is what Hadnot wrote about what, and some of you may know this document, what a young planner ought to know. Several years ago, being troubled in conscience, I examined somewhat more curiously than usual the curriculum in regional and city planning, which was being given at Harvard, nominally under my direction. I discovered many strange practices and conventions, but these seemed less arresting to me after 25 years of university life than the singular fact that no two instructors in planning had the same notion of what ought to be taught. The architects on the Faculty of Architecture taught architecture, the art historians taught art history, and the landscape architects taught the gentle art of improving nature. Each had his circumscribed fund of knowledge, his codified body of doctrine. The planner's province was the universe, amid whose illimitable stretches of space and time he appeared to have no other guide than his estimable intentions and his vagrant intuitions. Unaware of my audacity, I set out to bring some definition and order into this unplanned cosmos. I began by asking advice. I asked the chairman of each of the 7 score departments into which Harvard is divided. We live here in separate cells like doves in their dovecote, to tell me what courses of study were, in his judgment, indispensable to the education of a planner. What is it, I asked, that a young planner ought to know? I had in mind not so much the knowledge which pertains to a planner's trade, the tools by which he makes a living, as that range and depth of understanding which makes a planner truly serviceable to the forward march of humanity. 120 courses of study were described by at least one of my colleagues as essential to this end. 75 others were, quote, desirable. Now, there are 3 things about this fishing expedition which seem to me remarkable. First, the range and variety of the game which came to my net. Almost every intellectual discipline, excepting, as I remember it, the discipline of architecture, was included. The politics of Aristotle and the divine city of St. Augustine, for example, were offered to the student of planning in the same table d'hôte, which included the sanitation of water supply and the statistical analysis of municipal budgets. For soup, a bowl of the cultural history of the Age of Elizabeth. For fish, theories of social consciousness. And for sweets, new trends in education at Chicago. No profession, I think, was ever complemented by so wide an appraisement of its necessities. Yet the range and variety of this program of studies, the synthetic program which would have implemented the advice of all the chairmen of departments, astounded me less than its extraordinary length, a length unusual even for fauna as hardy as students of planning. 33 years would be required by this program for the general education of a planner. I mean by this the cultural disciplines which properly precede or at least accompany professional courses, so that, including these vocational courses and, of course, the necessary period of apprenticeship in the field, a student would be ready to begin his professional career at about the age of 70 years. The variety was indeed wide, the vista long and formidable, and yet these characteristics of this composite curriculum impressed me less when I came to understand the true nature of planning than still another and less easily recognizable characteristic, I mean wisdom. Who is this planner, this man who is to guide, to rebuild, to reorder this world? Who is to recognize and evaluate the deficiencies of our economy, to shield and encourage the healthful growth of society, prepare the way for the perfect life? This virtuoso in foreknowledge, this deputy God dispensing thunderbolt and sunshine. What discipline is too severe when measured against the fateful decisions that he must make? At what risk shall we place a single province of learning beyond his ken? He will build his ignorance into the fabric of the universe. Plato described 35 years of education for the planner. Only at the completion of that long curriculum was he to be flung into the world to make his living, and only if he survived 15 years longer in the world, unaided by special privilege, was he admitted into the sacred circle of planning. This education was not out of scale with the responsibility which Plato gave to planners. Once admitted to that circle, they were philosopher kings, planners untrammeled by money, wife, child, or Congress, ruling by the serene, uncontroverted power of wisdom over businessmen, farmers, soldiers, private property, and the CIO. In Plato, as in Lucretius, the planner views as from a mountaintop the clash of legions on the plain below, and like the gods above the field of Troy, charts the course and the victory. Here's the punchline. When Plato and the Harvard faculty are in agreement, there would seem to be little more to be said. Well, that gives you a sense, and I wanted to give you a sense of what Lewis Mumford was talking about when he spoke of his witty and felicitous pen. And of course, he brought that to the classroom, and that's why his course in the history of cities, which included the kind of remarks about cities that I mentioned, was memorable and important for us as students. Now, there's a third figure that I want to mention, little known today, Martin Wagner. Martin Wagner was a planner, a very important planner. He had been the chief planner of Berlin during the Weimar era, and of course had to flee when the Nazis came to power, and sponsored by Gropius, he was brought to Harvard in 1938. Martin Wagner was an extraordinary figure. Of course, he was a complete misfit in the Department of City and Regional Planning as it had then been conceived. And so originally he was actually assigned to the Department of Architecture, and indeed he was teaching courses which were open to us as architects. Wagner was, as I say, a misfit. He was a passionate socialist, passionately committed to social causes, to the technical issues involved in architecture. He was kind of he was an extraordinarily appealing figure to me, anyway. And one of the reasons he was appealing was because he thought the best thing to do with Boston was to simply remove it and start over. And of course, I was born and grew up in Boston. At that moment, couldn't wait to get out of Boston, thought that Boston was hopelessly moribund in every respect, socially, politically, culturally, economically. And I fell for this hook, line, and sinker. I thought it was just wonderful. This was actually student work, I believe, from a studio taught by Wagner. But later on, a couple of years later, there was something called the Boston Contest, quite well known at the time, where teams were invited to present proposals for the improvement of Boston. And you can see that Wagner went even further there. He didn't even leave Beacon Hill in place. And his images are so powerful. The hopeless complexity of the existing city versus the structure that he envisioned. With it, he submitted after he was rejected, he submitted a report with the following preface. This report on a better Boston was flunked by the jury of the Boston Contest. In a great attempt, it can be glorious to be flunked, because only those who have not succeeded know the real secret of success. And then he appended to that a letter to the judges, and I'm just going to quote 2 short paragraphs. The honor and the prizes you are offering the winners of this contest are enticing, but in our eyes, not enticing enough to silence our best judgment on what to do with your patient, the Metro Boston. We are too deeply in love with it to try to heal it by prayers and flatteries. As sworn in city doctors, we must speak out what we know to be the truth. Let us state bluntly what we think of your patient. We think that he is deathly sick. He suffers from the weakness of old age, from physical and mental debility, and above all, from the irresponsible treatment of complacent builders and bunglers who have ruined his body and soul with the quack practices of the laissez-faire, laissez-aller era. Well, I loved Martin Wagner. That's all I can say. And I was entranced by him. He was very approachable, very lively, very engaged, and of course, he wasn't really part of the city planning department. I mean, he was just a figure. He moved in the school in a way that we architecture students were very attracted by. It was somehow very appealing to us. And it was as a result of his influence, in fact, that in the summer of my, and there's, I'm sorry, should have put that up. That's the cover of his submission to the Boston Contest. In the summer of '47, in my second year in school, I think owing principally to the influence of Martin Wagner, I made a trip to Eastern Europe to study Reconstruction, where, of course, I was completely blown away by what I saw there, both the destruction and the extraordinary planning that was going on, the optimism, the energy, the creativity that was going into. This was in Warsaw. I came back and I wrote for Task magazine. Some of you might remember Task. It ceased publication, however, with this issue in 1948. This issue was edited by Martin Meyerson, who, of course, went on to a great career as a university president. He was then doing his PhD in planning, and I was one of the authors. I wrote a long piece about my experience in Poland, which the opening sentence, if I can remember it correctly, was, "The people of Poland have undertaken a bold experiment in democratic planning." Well, of course, about 6 months after this was published, Stalin stepped in, and that was the end of that experiment. So it was a sad outcome. But again, it was, I mention it because it somehow gives a sense of the aspirations that were inspired in us by students, by people like Gropius, like Hadnot, like Wagner. They were the figures who, in my recollection, still seem to me the keys, the people that shaped my time at the GSD and made my thesis project what it was. 30 years later, when I returned to Harvard at Jerry McHugh's invitation to chair the Department of Architecture, I brought certain lessons with me, and retrospectively, there were lessons that I brought from those three people. From Hadnot, the city must be understood as a living organism in a constant state of change. History must be integrated in the curriculum of a school of architecture from the very first day of study. That's why one of my first moves as chairman was to, with Jerry McHugh's assent, to launch a history search for a senior professor in history of architecture between 1500 and 1800. From Gropius, the student of architecture must find his own voice, and for this purpose, an independent thesis project is essential. That's why, again, one of the first things I did on becoming chair was to persuade the faculty that the thesis, which had been abandoned in '69, should be reinstituted. Also learned from Gropius, and I learned this because it was the opposite of what I got from him, the chairman of the Department of Architecture must make his presence felt through participation in reviews of student work. I had still such a vivid recollection of the neglect of that by Gropius that I vowed, and pretty much kept the vow, to attend at least part of every student review during the 5 years of my chairmanship. And from Wagner, bold ideas, though perhaps insufficient, are absolutely necessary in envisioning the future of cities. And again, something that shaped my chairmanship in ways that some of you will remember. Misfit intellectuals are essential ingredients in the faculty of a school of architecture. I'm glad to hear that some of you do remember that. Anyway, so now I've taken too much time, and I'm going to proceed to let others speak about their recollections, and then we're going to have a conversation, I hope, with all of you. And let me just introduce them quickly. Why don't we put the lights on and then ask everybody to go up? We can. And as I say, we've covered all the decades since the 40s, except one, unfortunately, because Carol Johnson, who wanted to be with us, she graduated in the 50s in landscape. She has had surgery and isn't quite up to it, so she had to cancel, regret it very much. But we have, from the 60s, Robert Campbell, AB 58, MArch 67, Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic for the Boston Globe. From the 70s, Robert Yaro, MCRP, 76, President and Chief Executive Officer of Regional Plan Association. From the 80s, Martin Poirier, MLA 86, founder of Spurlock Poirier Landscape Architects. From the 90s, Jeanne Gang, MArch 93, newly minted MacArthur Fellow, and founder of Studio Gang Architects. From the 90s also, Toni Griffin, Loeb Fellow 98, Professor of Architecture and Director of the J. Max Bond Center, City College of New York School of Architecture. And Marrikka Trotter, MDesS 09, PhD 16, current doctoral student, and co-editor of the Workbooks Project. So here we have an array of disciplines and an array of the era that we're celebrating. And we'll start with a few remarks, starting with Bob Campbell on each of these eras, and then go on, I hope, to some questions and response.
Thank you, Harry. Nobody's going to equal the presentation that you made today, especially since you only allow me 5 minutes to cover 20 years.
said you could have as much as
you
you
said a
want.
number of things that rang bells with me. You said how awful it was that Gropius appeared only twice during your career at the school, once to greet the incoming class and once at your thesis review. Cert did come to our incoming class at one review, and that was the only time I ever saw him. In 3.5 years, he did not come to my thesis review, so you did better with Gropius. He obviously was imitating Gropius, but I didn't realize that because his main interest was the master's class, which he taught himself and which I've always understood was quite wonderful. But that was nothing to do with me. I didn't go on to the master's class. My comments are going to be very personal, and I wish there were other people here from my class. Is there anyone here from? I don't think so, which may say something about the degree of enthusiasm we had for our time here. My comments are going to be mostly negative, and they're only mine, and you might hear different ones from different people. First of all, it was an incredibly different world. It was nearly all male. After first year, it was all male, and working on parallel rules. And we had a rule that the biggest guy in the room at any given moment decided what was on everybody's radio. So there wouldn't be the conflict of many different programs going on at the same time. Well, now, of course, everybody's plugged in privately. And when I started to think about this, I wrote down, well, the school was in transition. And then I thought, no, all schools are always in transition. Our problem was that we weren't in transition. We were in a kind of a dead period, I think, between the last dying bugle of the Gropius era and the revolution that occurred just after I left in 1968, 69. I left in 67. The Gropius era lived primarily in the first year when we did what had been done in the Bauhaus. People from the three different disciplines, landscape architecture, and city planning, were supposedly collaborating with each other in the first year. Since none of them yet had any skills with which to collaborate, that didn't work out very well. But there was that kind of hangover, let's call it, of the Gropius era. And then but the great dominant presence in the school was that of Cert. Even though he didn't teach himself, his buildings were going up all around us, the Holyoke Center, Peabody Terrace, others. And the Corbusian tradition was so powerful in the school that you couldn't get away with doing anything else. If you happened to be in love with Frank Lloyd Wright, God forbid, as one of my classmates was, you were just pounded to death until you could think of nothing except board-in-place concrete and bright colors for the rest of your life. There was very little intellectual life in the school at that time. Everything that was known about architecture was already known and had been articulated. There was no point thinking about it. There were no revolutionary ideas. You just learned it and did it. And what you learned was was that rather narrow European-oriented attitude about architecture. And the extent to which the school was Eurocentric in those days is incredible to me in retrospect. Everybody was looking at Europe all the time. It was as if the United States didn't exist. There was no sense of intellectual curiosity and exchange. There was isolation in so many different ways, and Harry mentioned this too. We were isolated within the university. There was no connection between the Graduate School of Design and anything else in the university. The Carpenter Center had been built to deal with issues that were very similar to ours, but it was purely for undergraduates, and there was no cross-registration back and forth. We were isolated within the country. I don't think very many students in my class realized that the two buildings that were built in Greater Boston that interested us the most, which were Boston City Hall by Coleman and McKinnell, both of whom taught in the school, and Peabody Terrace by Cert, who of course was dean of the school. The buildings we most admired were absolutely detested by 95% of the population, and still are to this day. Whether they should be or not is another question. But I think that isolation was so extraordinary. It's as if we had been in a kind of a closet, a kind of European closet somewhere adrift on the coast of the Americas. The compass always pointed toward Europe. I wrote down concrete, bright colors, Cert, totally dominant aesthetic. And then I'll just run through some names that were influential in the faculty. They all came from somewhere other than the United States. Jerzy Zoltan, Gerhard Kallman, Michael McKinnell, Joseph Zalewski, Jose Luis Sert, Willa von Moltke. This was the backbone. They had their assistants, but they were the principal teachers and the leaders in the school at that time. And some of them I thought were very good teachers, and I'll mention that later on. The second generation of American modernists, one of whom sits next to me, mostly went to the GSD. And in my 4 years here, because I took one semester off, it was 4 full years, not one of them, I.M. Pei, Harry Cobb, John Johansson, Ed Barnes, Paul Rudolph, Ulrich Franzen, and probably a dozen others, not one of them came to a lecture or a jury in those years. That's how isolated and how Eurocentric we were, and we were not listening to these architects. And they were perfectly willing. My class got fed up with it, and we invited Kevin Roach and Paul Rudolph at different times to come for a pizza evening with half my class. Half my class were a sort of organization, and they both came. And they both had a good time, and they would love, I'm sure, to have been invited to a jury if anyone had ever thought that might be appropriate. And Rudolph was chairman at Yale at the time. I mean, he had credentials, surely. I'll never forget something Rudolph said, and it was very appropriate for what Mosen was saying earlier. Rudolph said to us, the students, it's very important that a school should have a definite point of view about architecture and teach only that point of view insistently. Short pause. Otherwise, you'll have nothing to rebel against. I thought there was a lot of truth to that. And it's a very different world today. And it's not only in this school, in every school in the country that I know of or have any contact with, there is a garden of 1,000 ideas growing up in every corridor, and there is no overwhelming point of view. I don't mean overwhelming, but governing kind of point of view. Excuse me. That all changed with Jerry McHugh and Harry Cobb 10 years after I was out of here, and the plane seemed to arrive every week or so from Chicago in Harry's era, bringing exactly the kind of bizarre spirits that you were describing earlier that every school should have. And I think it was very healthy. I'm trying to answer some of the questions that Harry gave us, and one of them was what was well taught and what was not well taught. Oddly enough, history was very well taught. Edward Seckler and Jim Ackerman and other people during my time taught architectural history thoroughly and eloquently and very, very well. So that it may have been a no-no for Gropius, but it came back very quickly under Sert, and I think he deserves credit for that. But almost everything else was poorly taught. This was not a good school at that time. And I just listed some things that were not well taught. Presentation, drawing, construction, practice, theory. Theory didn't exist. What was known was already known. There was nothing to talk about. And then there was this nonsensical phrase, we're not a trade school. Well, of course every architecture school is a trade school, just as a medical school is a trade school. How would you like your architects to be trained the way, your doctors to be trained the way architects are? On the other hand, they were very responsive to criticism. You have to remember, those of you who are young, if there are any who are young, Sert ran the school with an office of 2 or 3 people, secretaries. There was no administration in the way that there is today. And they were very open and responsive to criticism. You could walk into the office and talk to anyone there any time of day. And I became very irritated when Ben Thompson, who at that time was chair, and by the way, Sert came in solving the problem of the Gropius-Hudnut division because they gave him both jobs. He was both chairman and dean. And that was the solution to the incredible problem. And about some years later, by the time I got there, they had split it again, and they gave Benjamin Thompson, who was a very well-known architect at that time, the chairmanship. And when it came time for me to do the thesis, I decided that Ben was wrecking the program, and I wrote the kind of letter that only a kid would write, listing by name the 23 or whatever it was, members of the faculty who would not be acceptable as thesis critics for me. And I listed by name in descending order the 3 who would be acceptable. And it was very, very open world. And Ben read that letter aloud to the incoming thesis class, maintaining my anonymity, and asked for comments on it. Gave me my first choice critic when I took the semester off because I was so annoyed with the school. Gave me my first choice critic. And I think that was a kind of a familial quality. You could go and talk to people in a very direct way. There were no layers of hierarchy in between. I had very good teachers. Michael McKinnell, my thesis critic, and Tom Stifter, who assisted him, were both wonderful teachers. And Tom Stifter, whom some of you may have known, was controversial in some ways, but as far as I was concerned, he was a terrific teacher. Al Szabo, teaching the first year in the kind of Bauhaus hangover, was a very good teacher. A kind of Bauhaus logic rooted in the plan and the practical, and something I don't always see in the school today, that generation by the plan of the architecture. Gerhard Kallman, in a single jury, blew my mind with his eloquence about urban form. I never had CERT, as I say. Joseph Zalewski, a wonderful person, would come in on Sunday nights. He was so eager to teach, and if you were lucky enough to be around, his willingness, his passion for architecture, his willingness to draw right along with you was very impressive. He told me once when we became friends in later years that every building that he'd worked on in Warsaw before the war had been demolished. And I looked at him sadly, and he said, "Thank God." He was the only one who taught, and Michael McKinnell, I guess, also. Teachers didn't teach in school in those days, and I don't know whether they do now. They gave you a problem, and they let you try to solve it, and they looked at what you'd done, and they told you what was wrong with it, and that was what passed for teaching. Nobody sat down and said, as I think teachers should, and as I've tried to do when I've taught design, here's how I might have gone about it. Here's one approach, not the only one, but you might think about starting the, why? And I think it would be wonderful if design teachers would sit down in the class and to solve the problem at the same time the students are solving it, as a role model, as an example of how to do things. Joseph and to some extent McKinnell did that. There were secondary lessons, the jury system where you got up in front of everybody in a state of terror and defended your project. I learned, I don't know whether you'll agree with me now, but I learned public speaking. I learned how to take criticism. I learned how to, it's a very important lesson you learn in architecture school, is the ability to speak in public to a group of possibly critical people. At the end of my time, I wanted to say one more thing about CERT. The most important thing he did was start the urban design program. And that was what he gave his greatest attention to. He was running CIAM, out of Harvard all the time that I was here. It was essentially a Harvard production in those years. And I asked him once in later years when we became friends, I worked in his office, I became an associate in his office, about would he define urban design, and he gave me the most perfect example of what he thought urban design was. He said, urban design is city planning as done by architects. That's all you need to know. And what he meant, of course, was it was planning done physically and spatially in 3 dimensions. And that was what he hoped to bring to it. I was followed by the revolution, and I can't talk about that. Well, you can't imagine how rigid the school was. You went first year with Al Szabo, second year with Ron Gurley, third year with Joseph Zalewski. There were no choices along the way. That was design studio. And suddenly there was this explosion that's just been talked about by Harry. And there were option studios and students taking over everything, and everything kind of broke down and loosened up. And for a few years was a little discombobulated, and maybe we'll hear that from the next person. And then Harry and Jerry McHugh, a very powerful leadership team, came in and put the school back together. Thank you very much.
It's all been pretty eloquent up until now, so I don't know whether I can match that. But I did come in after the revolution, I guess. I started at the GSD in '73, and so much had changed in those intervening years. The strike had happened just 4 years before that. Earth Day had happened. The environmental revolution had happened. There was a revolution in city planning in which we learned that you don't tear down cities, that you design around cities and you work with cities and you work with citizens. And I think there was there's an enormous ferment and turmoil in the planning profession, and a lot of that, of course, was reflected in the curriculum here. And there was enormous turmoil in this building. I think there probably always has been, and that might be the hallmark of the GSD, that tension that always exists between the design professions. And I think that can be and has been used in a constructive way. And it certainly was that way when I was a student here. I had the privilege of this was my neighborhood planning school. I lived on Carver Street, and I applied to Harvard and MIT. I was working at the Boston Redevelopment Authority. I see Dick Merton here and some of my other colleagues, and so I was really being at the BRA in those days, and there were an incredibly dedicated band of talented designers and planners and economists and landscape architects. That was an education all by itself, and to be able to split my time between that place and this place, was an extraordinary privilege. I came here for two reasons. One, it was my neighborhood planning school, and then when I was accepted at MIT and at Harvard, and I think this was probably one of the hallmarks of the place. This place had become so much less rigid just after you left, because the students had nearly torn the place down, and at Yale they burned it down. So there was there.
That is not true.
What's that?
Nobody set that fire. I've looked into it.
Oh, you looked into it. Okay. It might have. Okay. Okay, we're going to buy you a drink later on and find out who set the fire. And so when I came in, I was accepted, and then I told, I try to remember who it was that was doing admissions in those days, but I said, look, I'm only going to come if I can come part-time for a couple of years. And they said, okay. And so I was able to design a program that worked for me, which I thought was a terrific graduate program. We had a required, a set of courses in quantitative methods and economics and so forth, which have been incredibly valuable to me. But we also had the freedom, and I guess it'd be interesting to hear. You did not apparently to use this entire university and MIT as your campus. And I took coursework. I was interested in environmental planning and environmental design. I was welcomed by Carl Steinitz and Peter Hornbeck, and to do. And I got into landscape planning with Carl Steinitz. He was not a popular guy, I guess, for the landscape faculty in those days, and had trouble getting tenure and so forth. But he was an extraordinary teacher, and he opened the world of regional planning and landscape planning to me and to literally hundreds of other students over a 30-year period. And the fact that I had the flexibility to do that, I think, was a tribute to the. Now maybe it's just nobody was in charge. I'm not really quite sure, And this is the thing about being a graduate student in a place that is where there's some turmoil. I'm probably the last MCRP, the Masters of City and Regional Planning, who graduated from the GSD, because the program went over to the Kennedy School the following year, and I actually ran into a Kennedy School regional planner the other day. It's hard to believe that such things exist, but so the place was in turmoil. I remember going back and forth between Boston City Hall and this place, and two thoughts. One is that both of these buildings were brand new and not much loved. But as a young planner and as a young student, you learn to navigate and to live with these places. And I was saying to somebody today that coming back here, and I also got to teach here in the 90s over several years, and so I've spent time in this building. I think it's aged pretty well. And someone asked me, well, why I thought that was the case, and I said, well, I think it's the warm materials and human scale of the building. And now we know it's the alum from Vegas who donated this curtain that has.
No, it was a student competition.
Oh, okay. Dean, you take the money from wherever it comes from, isn't that right? So that's right. So, any rate, so I found this place to be incredibly flexible to me, there was part of the constructive change that came out of the environmental revolution. Of course, was a whole new approach to not just landscape planning, but to land use planning, land use regulation. 1974, I think, was the year my first or second year here. The Quiet Revolution and land use regulation was written, and we had extraordinary teachers here, and both from the law school and at the GSD. Charlie Haar, of course, taught the land use course in those days, and Gerald Caden was his young assistant, I believe, and then joined the faculty. So Harvard was teaching cutting-edge environmental planning and environmental design, And at least my experience was that this was equally shared between the planning students and the landscape students at the time. I don't know if that's continued. It'd be interesting to see if it has. The architecture students were left out in the cold. They had their, and I think one of the things that's happened in this school and in all the other schools is that the enforcers of the professional guilds have moved in, the accreditation committees, and have tried to create these firewalls between the programs. At least at that point in time, we didn't seem to have that. I was able to do coursework not only throughout the GSD and not all the programs, but in planning, urban design, landscape architecture, but at the business school and real estate. Finance and real estate development, not-for-profit management. I've been running a not-for-profit not-for-profits for 30 years, so not a bad set of skills to get. And again, it wasn't exactly open arms, but they tolerated GSD students, and I got a heck of an education in that over there. MIT Civil Engineering, fabulous place. Public health, and again, environmental health was a hot topic then, and is a hot topic now. I think the studio requirements in planning then, I don't know if this is still the case, was a superb learning experience for me and for all of our peers. We had an experience like yours where I can't remember who the professor was in my final studio, but we were handed a problem. Professor showed up with the problem, told us to how to get to Farmington, Maine, where the local industry, wood processing industry, had just collapsed. The Maine Central Railroad was in receivership, and this town was in ferment. Told us how to get there, and gave me the name of the town manager and said studios to figure out what to do. And I think there were 8 of us. We figured out what to do, and it was an extraordinary experience in learning how to break down an incredibly complex social, economic, land use, environmental problem, break it down into bite-sized pieces, work with local folks to get input, find solutions, and to get up and present it. And I'll reiterate what you said before, that one of the things I think this school does superbly, or at least it did when I was a student, was to force you to get up in front of public and to, it may not appear that way with my public speaking, but at least my colleague, you learn how to get up in front of an audience and communicate with them. I remember right after 9/11, when we were working on the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site at RPA, the USA Today came out with one of those stupid front page polls that they do just to fill up newspapers, and it asked Americans what their greatest fears were. Number 1 was sudden violent death. Number 2 was public speaking, and you can't get out of this school. At least in my experience those days, I think it's still the case, without learning how to present a complex problem in a cogent way, and to engage with with the people on the other side of the table. At any rate, so for me, this was a rich and rewarding experience. So one thing I wanted to say was just that, the place was in ferment, and I remember going back and forth between Boston City Hall and Gund Hall, and having this sense that the politics were a lot tougher at this end of the red line than they were at the other end of the red line. I don't know, Dick, I don't know if that was your experience as well, but as a graduate student, you're not in the middle of it, but you can tell that there's this swirling vortex of intrigue and politics going on, and it was going on then. I think it's probably been one of the constants going back to Hudnut. You gave us a little taste of it, what was going on while you were there, and I think while you were here, and so forth. So and maybe that's something that is one of the great attributes of this school. That ferment means that people are really struggling to define their own disciplines, and then the cross-discipline synergies and so forth. So at any rate, let's check in on the 80s and see how things had settled out. Wow.
First, I want to say, let's all think a good thought for Carol Johnson. I'd rather be sitting out there listening to her than speaking myself. And then I'd also like to just make a couple of observations, since I've had, I think, about 45 minutes to prepare, so I'm not going to be witty or intelligent. But this arc from Hudnut on, and the School of Design as a collaborative thing, is something I'd like to make a comment on, and that is that for a year now I've been on the Alumni Council, so I've gotten to listen to our deans, and I'd have to say that collaboration, in my opinion, has gone from the minds of these people into the hearts of Moisen, the hearts of Raoul, the hearts of Scott, and the hearts of Charles, and I really feel collaboration, and it's in a very different way probably than Hudnut or any of the others thought. And it's a collaboration that is really, in Moisen's words today, the global collaboration. So with that, I grew up with 3 sisters, and I feel really comfortable being here on the side of by coincidence, on the side of the middle of the table here, and also in this sort of arc of preparedness, perhaps, that these gentlemen have been through, because by the mid-'80s when I came here, I'd say things were humming. The great work that Harry put in place, Jerry McHugh, which I believe was in probably every one of the juries that I participated in as a landscape architect. A lot of these things, so I hope folks can be heartened that, you know, stuff does eventually happen, and it mattered a lot to me. This was, as for probably all of you out there, this experience here at Harvard changed my life for the better, I think. It was a time when I believe those of us in landscape architecture that had been paying attention to the arc of environmentalism had gotten it, and we'd gotten to a point where it was not about a time of arguing about whether design formal interventions in the landscape were better than environmental thought. So we were being able to take the best of both. It was a very, that period of the 80s was when the economy was booming in America. So I think maybe that had something to do with the forward-thinking momentum that faculty brought to the work. But again, another comment that indeed all schools were relatively well represented during crits. So that whole era of never seeing your faculty was gone. I had the opportunity to take a studio my first semester, co-taught by Peter Walker, Frank Gehry, and Klaus Oldenburg, and I was just in awe the whole time. And I would say too that looking back, the amount of time that Peter Walker would spend in studio with us, he was here all the time. Every second day he was here. The availability of all the faculty was intensely available, and it was that period of when Rafael Moneo was here, Harry was in and out, and at that time Carl Steinitz had really helped to manifest the whole linking between Ian McHarg and the computer as it was moving forward. Richard Foreman was here for his first year. Very, very rich time for that. The beginnings of where it's just so remarkable to watch, to see where we are now with Charles' leadership in landscape architecture, to see the benefits of that. So since I'm not that well prepared, I'm going to stop with that and let perhaps Harry ask a good question.
Anyone from the 90s here? Oh, good. I graduated with a master in architecture, and what was interesting was the time that I was here was really split between Moneo and Max Goggin. So they kind of, I had 2 years with one and a year and a half with the other, and I think it was a really interesting time. The main thrust of the school under Moneo was a very European-centric faculty that was here, but really interesting. But at the same time, that was when theory was the main discussion, and I remember that during Moneo's period, one of the favorite publications was called 9H. You know, the hardest possible lead that you could get in a lead holder. And then as Mac ushered in a new era of more, I guess I would say it's more like the big fat Sharpie era. But what was interesting too was that I think it represents, I mean, for me, the stress on theory was because I was coming from a background of really liking to make things and very hands-on. So the theory part was somewhat of a killjoy in the beginning, but then after like all of the GSD, you go through the pain, and then you start to understand later in your experience how it's enriching, the enriching aspect of the pain. So it was really just these theory courses that Michael Hayes would teach the whole student body, and I saw that slipping away through Mac's era, and the cusp was really on a new focus on making, and there was the shop became very active, and actually the shop became so active that it broke out of the shop, and Kimo Griggs was a professor that invited students over to his shop, so there started to become this multiplicity in the school, which was, at the end of the day, a huge benefit. Then to say something about the student body, my class was the first class that was admitted that was more women than men in the history of the school, which was pretty exciting. And we had my first studio. We had one of those studios out there. We called it the Nave of Powerful Women, and a lot of my professors are still here. Scott Cohen, Mohsen Mostafavi. But what was interesting about the student body was just that new mix, and I think the strongest impression, because Harriet asked us to think about how did you change, what was your experience like when you were here, was really that camaraderie and challenging relationship that you have with the fellow students, who are probably amongst the most ambitious architecture students in the country. And so you fill a school up with those personalities, and it gets very interesting. And then I think from a personal side, my own experience, which might have been a little bit different than others, was that I had a lot of experience in structures and construction, so I basically was able to pass out of a lot of the required courses for the master's, and that allowed me to, in my time that was freed up, explore some of the deeper reaches, some of the really interesting and kind of radical seminars. Scott Cohen taught one, other ones that were very technical through people like Dan Shodek, and finally being able to, even though there wasn't really anything in place to allow this collaboration with other parts of the school, I was able to attend some amazing lectures in the college. One of my favorites was Stephen Jay Gould was here at the time, and Fleming taught European intellectual history, American intellectual history. I took courses in the VES art history courses. So I was able to, I think it wasn't a designed curriculum, but it was very spread out and reaching into very far parts of the university at large. And I think what's exciting to me now is that there are actually paths. I think some of my other classmates were doing the same thing. I recently was speaking to Sean Donovan, who was going over to the Kennedy School, and then ultimately became the housing secretary. So he definitely had other interests that you didn't really know about at the time. So I think it's great that the school's moving in the direction of broadening these experiences, because this is the contemporary world that we're in today. So thank you.
So I'm also the 90s, the mid-90s, but I'm an interloper. I'm a Loeb Fellow. So we're a different breed in that we didn't sit in any one curriculum. In fact, people sometimes looked at us with a raised eyebrow. Why are you here? What are you doing? Our cohort is fairly diverse. In fact, I was the only architect in my class. I had spent 10 years at SOM in Chicago before coming. My classmates were developers, science writers for the New York Times, product designers. There was one planner. Quite diverse, and I was also the youngest, so I was the closest in age to the actual student body. And I have to go on record of saying it's one of the best professional and personal careers years of my life, and extremely transformative. I was in SOM, which was a multidisciplinary firm. I started working with Bruce Graham in his schizophrenic period between modernism and postmodernism in London, and Charles Waldheim and I sat in the studio for a couple of months living through that. And at the end of that phase was the recession of the early 90s, where folks were coming back from London, losing their jobs. I got smart and switched over to urban design and planning because work was happening there. But a little confused. Unlike most architects, we think we can do everything until you're actually sitting there doing it. And I had the hardest time transitioning in scale. And a colleague, Martha Wellborn, then Martha Lampkin, suggested the Loeb Fellowship. I had no idea what it was. I was working in Detroit, heading up the Detroit office at the time, and couldn't imagine taking a year off to come and, play around at Harvard. The second year running the Detroit office, going there 4 days a week, I was very ready for a break and applied and got the fellowship. And it was at a time, I guess, in the mid-90s where a couple of things were going on that I was becoming interested in as I was moving through this transition from architecture to urban design and planning. In Chicago in particular, which happens to be also where I'm from, but I wasn't working there. I was just frustrated that I wasn't working. We were just talking about this, Scott, in an American context. I'm sitting in one of the country's major architectural capitals, and I can't get my hands on addressing American city urban problems. At the time, gentrification was really top of mind. We had Mayor Daley in his early years running around the West Loop, trying to gentrify it for the cameras in time for the 1996 Democratic National Convention, which was actually going to be on the same footprint as the '68 Democratic National Convention and pretty much look the same as a bombed-out community. It was at a time where new urbanism was all the rave and was being appropriated by the time by the federal government in the form of Hope 6 and design policy and regulation. And I was watching communities of color where my parents grew up and where I grew up slowly changing or wrestling with notions of cultural identity and revitalization. And here I was again sitting at one of the most prominent architecture firms in the city and not able to interact with that community or those constituencies. So I wrote this proposal in the middle of the night, sent it off, and fortunately, through Bill Doble's insight and trust in me, became a Loeb Fellow in '97. Came into this room to the Option Studio presentations. I don't know if anyone's been to those recently, but they are quite fascinating if you're not used to this culture. And I remember walking out of the room with my Loeb Fellows going, what was that? They were studying problems all over the world. And I didn't really hear anything that was speaking to the kinds of things that I was interested in, except one studio. And unlike Bob, I won't be so bold as to name names, but I went to this professor afterwards and told him who I was and what I was doing and my background and so forth, and asked if there was any way I can engage with his studio just by coming in and doing critiques or listening on the dialogue, and I was told emphatically no. And as I tried to make ways around to some of the architects, I didn't get a very warm reception. So in fact, most of the things that I was interested in looking at, I ended up finding elsewhere and outside of the school for the longest time. This was at a time when Cornell West, Skip Gates, Anthony Appiah, and William Wilson were at the school at the same time. So there were other schools that were talking about urban issues in a way different than I was as a designer. The Kennedy School was very interesting to me. But two things happened. Number one, posters are all over the school, and the student activism at the school at that time and even today was just extraordinary. And I found a constituency of folks who were talking about things happening in communities and in cities and in regions at the student body scale. They were taking the initiative to create dialogues and integrate and do exactly what the dean is doing now, forge audiences of collaboration where their curriculum perhaps fell short inside the school. Secondly, I did begin to get to know faculty more. In the Loeb Fellowship, we have dinners every Tuesday night, and we get to invite whomever we want to come. I know Bob Campbell's been to several of those. And so we just began to brainstorm and cherry pick faculty that we wanted to get to know. And as we did that, we uncovered such an amazing resource within the GSD and within the school overall of faculty, and this speaks a little bit to your point earlier, who were doing their individual research and projects that were so fascinating to us and the kinds of issues our cohort was talking about in terms of things that were happening in American cities. So my second semester really did open up, and I began to do more collaborative work with different faculty by either sitting in on seminars, coming in to talk about my work or the proposal that I was looking at the time. I was watching Alex Krieger very carefully because he was a rabid critic of new urbanism at the time and writing a great deal about it. But I left that year with a much broader both understanding and hunger to impact cities, and American cities in particular. So I actually gave my resignation to SOM at the end of that year and went into the public sector. I've spent time in New York, Deputy Planning Director in Washington, D.C., Planning Director in Newark, New Jersey, and last 18 months working in Detroit. And it was because of that year that I got this 10-month crash course on the complexity of issues facing American cities and the fact that there weren't that many folks in the public sector educated in schools like this who were in fact creating those policies, hiring architects, making public policy decisions, that I made a very deliberate decision to go into the public sector. And I continued with the good fortune to come back and teach here over the last 5 years to build a curriculum in the Option Studios, which I think is one of the most collaborative forms of pedagogy that the school has, to try to bring those lessons I learned from sitting in a Cornell West class on W.E.B. Du Bois or at the Kennedy School and from my colleagues here on the ways in which designers and the way that they are trained need to understand the complexity of urban systems, be they physical, economic, or social or environmental, in the solving of everything from a building to an open space system to an urban framework to a zoning regulation. So this has been a fabulous time here at the GSD, and if you know of anybody who would make a great Loeb Fellowship and become part of this community, I highly recommend that you recommend them. Thank you.
So I'm the baby here in this illustrious company.
Okay.
I started the MDesS program in 2007, and I graduated in 2009. And I was in the little tiny history and theory concentration that by the time I had graduated had become the history and philosophy of architecture concentration. Design. The MDesS, when I started, was a kind of live in the corridors experience. We didn't have our own space like we do now, like the MDesS students do now. And we sort of went halfway in between wherever our little homes were and the basement level of the library with our little carrels, and carved out some space in camaraderie. At the same time, it was a transformative and welcome experience, and I feel very privileged to have come here. I can sum up my expectations. This was another one of the questions. I can sum up my expectations with 2 words and 1 initial: K. Michael Hayes. And I got to the school and found out that we had lent him out to Ohio State for a year. And discovered instead Sylvia Lavin, Jeffrey Kempness, and then finally Sanford Quinter, who totally blew my mind. And I think I've spent the last 4 years trying to put together the kind of psychoanalytical approach to architectural thought and the scientific epistemological approach to thought that K. Michael Hayes on one hand and Sanford Quinter on the other hand represented for those of us who have recently been at the school. When I came to the GSD, I came from practice. I had already done my professional training, and I was very unfamiliar with the approach to architecture that values it as a collection, cohesive collection of aesthetic objects. For me, architecture was a practice. It was a way of thinking that extended to a way of acting in the world. And the GSD didn't change my view, but it gave me the language, the conceptual clarity, the rigor of thinking, and the historical knowledge to be able to express my opinion in a way that would allow me to enter the debate. And that is a gift indeed. I would say that during my time at the school, and I think this might still be continuing since it hasn't been that long, one of the things that we've wrestled with the most, and this is kind of underlying surface issues and surface tensions between the different schools, the different departments, the different approaches that are represented, is disciplinarity, actually. And so there are these kind of surface chasms that divide sort of the sustainability people and the people who work on slums from the form and discourse people. And there are those that are interested in the built environment as a whole, and then there are those that are interested in the disciplinary problems and projects of architecture, landscape architecture, urban form as such. And between, we could say, the post-critical maybe on the one hand and the intelligent on the other, there was a basic question, almost an epistemological question, about disciplinarity and what it means to practice, think, and interact in such a way that architecture, landscape architecture, design in general, and all of the urban planning and urban design make a cohesive impact, project futures and ideas and opportunities that do not exist in the present, find genealogies for those possibilities in the past, and present the potentials for others than the status quo. And I think this question about how we proceed, how we think about the discipline of what we're engaged in, remains the heart of the GSD's project, and is a project that is a privilege to be a part of.
Thank you, everyone. In the few minutes we have left, I think if there are some questions, it would be good to let them happen, yes.
Maybe a comment on Robert Campbell. I was here in 1962 in planning, and it was city and regional planning, and it was completely different from the architecture group because we were very collaborative with other units, also with MIT, and you could also take classes at Penn if you wanted. So the experience was completely different. That's all.
I think Bob Yaro made that point too. I think that's true, yeah.
Bob Yaro, I graduated around the time you did, but I think you left out a fairly major aspect to the 70s, which has made this place what it is today, and that is the city planning department migrated to the Kennedy School, and then it came back. Now, the bubble you were living in, I guess, in Cambridge and the PRA, you didn't see that, but a lot of people got very angry during that period, and they have never come back again here. I was just wondering, did that affect you? I mean, at the time I was here, the city planning department was an econometrics-oriented organization. It had little to do with physical design.
Yeah.
And the answer to all urban problems were regression theory problems being worked out. And I found it confounding. However, at the time, I was a veteran of Vietnam, and I was happy to be alive, so I put up with anything in that period, and I was happy to be here. But a lot of people were very disappointed coming out of the 60s, and the radical 60s being expecting to have a democratic process here to decide what they were going to study and what they were going to see. Your sort of being at the BRA and then coming here and then, you know, going back and forth, you seem to have a job and you seem to have, you know, a real focus on what you were doing. So I guess my question is, after all this, is did that affect you at all, how things were being taught, and did you notice that it got lost for 10 years or so, and now it came back?
Yeah, well, as I pointed out, I'm the last MCRP. Oh, you are? Okay. I thought I was the last of the Mohicans. I'm the second last of the Mohicans. And no, so that was going on, and the place was in turmoil. But, you know, it's funny, if you talk to all of these folks, the consistent theme is the place has always been in turmoil. And I used to think that was a problem. I used to think that was you know, a permanent, you know, handicap of this place. And I'm coming to think, you know, it's funny, I work in New York, and I always tell people, if you're looking for neat and tidy and easy, you can move to Des Moines, and it's neat and tidy and easy. You want to come to a place where it's complex and interesting and where life happens and so forth, there's some tension. You know, that's what goes on here. You know, it's the same kind of thing. So, yes, it was in some turmoil. The program went over there. It migrated back. But for me, at least, there was enough of the old line with Reg Isaacs and Frank Viget and some of the others here, you know, Alan Alschuler and so forth. That was, you know, I got a very and then I had the freedom, as you did 10 years earlier, to study almost. And now it was a required, you know, core curriculum, which, you know, I was dragged through. I was in the last generation that had to go to the science center, maybe you did too, to use a computer, and there were these wizards over there that would, you know, pull back the screen and show you what this thing was. We'd do multiple regression analyses, and you'd flip on this thing, and the lights would dim all over Cambridge when we turned on the computer, you know. And and the thing, the mainframe of the university had, you know, less power than my iPad does now, but that was, and so yes, we had that, but then at least my sense was that, you know, probably 70% of the coursework that I did after I did that core curriculum, 4 or 5 courses, everything else, you know, this whole town, it's not just Harvard, but Harvard and MIT, it was like a candy store. And we had the freedom to do it all. That description, by the way, of the city plan, not a bad one. Because if you're really serious about doing city and regional planning, you've got to know a lot. Everything's connected to everything else, and you've got to have at least a superficial knowledge of you know, a very broad range of issues in order to not to do stupid things. And so we were able to take courses all over this phenomenal university and MIT. It was an amazing experience for me. And then, you know, okay, there's a little turmoil. Who cares? You know.
I'd like to try to fill in a gap between Harry Cobb and Bob Campbell, because I entered Harvard College in 1949, and I finished in '56 in the Graduate School of Design. During that time, Walter Gropius retired and Jose Cert came, and so I was, I don't know whether you can say privileged, but I had the opportunity to experience both of them to some degree. Cert more than Gropius, although Gropius was instrumental in my making the decision to become an architect. I won't go into that, but during that time, because Gropius had finally been able to introduce his Design 1 course, his Bauhaus course, into the Graduate School of Design. I was able to take that, and then that was while I was an undergraduate, actually, and it was offered as architectural sciences as a concentration. I entered the Graduate School of Design in my senior year in college, and during that time, Gropius had retired. Cert had not been appointed yet, but we had, in the second year, we had Noam Gabo and Siegfried Gideon coming in. During the third year, we had Paul Rudolph as our critic in the third year, one of our critics in the third year, and Ovi Arup himself as a critic in the third year. Paul Rudolph designed the Wellesley College Science Building in our drafting room because he didn't have an office in Cambridge. Then that CERT had come that year. The master's class had been reformed. He was trying to do away with the bachelor's degree and the thesis. He put us all into the master's class. Some of us survived, some did not. Some went back into the thesis program for the bachelor's degree. But CERT, I was fortunate to have CERT as a critic in the master's class, and as much as we all hated him because there was absolutely no empathy between CERT and the students, at least those first 2 years. I don't know what it was later, but I must say I think I learned a great deal from him during that period, as doctrinaire as he was.
I was going to fill in what I thought was the gap. I came to the GSD in '63. I graduated MArch in '67 and urban design in 66 and then 67. It was a one-year program then. And I don't think I was at the same place, even though I know I was, with Bob Campbell, because my experience was so totally different. I remember it as this enormously integrative place that I had all sorts of experiences, and similar to what you were describing, that the whole world was my oyster here in Cambridge. And I could call on anybody at the law school, at the business school. I remember having Mort Zuckerman come over and critique something I was working on. He said it wouldn't work, and the next week, practically, he started the project. But it was a very exciting time. And I remember Dean Serret is one of the most warm people that you could possibly imagine, and he was always at all of our and he was always at our any of our critiques. And when we had our theses, we could call in. If we were doing a courthouse, we would simply go over to the law school and find a judge and have them on our review panel.
Sure.
And it was a very different experience that I remember. However, it is a donut hole, and then your class became more involved in the problems of the war, and I saw some of that during the urban design years that I was only 1 year at that time. But I do think that one thing that's totally missing, if you're talking about trying to get integration between the departments, is to return to the program where you did have the the planners, the landscape architects, and the urban designers, and they were all in the same program together. I can't remember whether it was one semester or a week, but whatever it is, we all knew each other by name. Everybody in the planning department, everybody in the landscape, everybody in architecture, we all knew each other after that semester, and it was a good process. But that's my whole.
My name is George Kelso, and I feel just very grateful to the teachers and the students that I experienced in the master's class of 1964. The teachers were Aldo Van Eyck, Jerzy Sultan, Jose Louis Cert, Ben Thompson. And we had to actually chase Aldo Van Eyck out of the studio. He was just there all the time, and it was a certain kind of unique accessibility and openness he had. And then Ben Thompson and Sultan eventually became my mentor. Ben Thompson, and from the vernacular and the kind of style of the Van Eyck, of Sultan, especially Cert, which were very Corbu, of course. Then to meet Ben Thompson, who had to shift gears, and and he would say, "Well, interesting space. Why do you open this to that? What's the communication between those two spaces. And I just thought, well, draw it better. And he wouldn't go for it. And I'll tell you, for the first time in my life at Harvard, I went to Widener Library. Ben Thompson grilled me enough that I went to Widener Library, and I really meant it. If I don't understand the word communication, I'm not going to pass this problem. So it was what experience, and Ben was this tremendous, demanded that things really be refined and very practical. So I'd say in general, it was a little kind of like a boot camp. And we went 24 hours a day, and the spirit of the class was, how can we make Harvard a better place? And it was a great time to be at Harvard. Nobody locked doors, and I just feel very grateful for that experience.
I'm really delighted that this afternoon has had so much emphasis on collaboration. I would like to tell you the very first time that I heard the word collaboration I was in Gropius's master's class. And the very first day when we met, Gropius said to us, there are 16 of you. There are actually 16, not 15, Harry. There are 16 because we were able to put in 16 drafting boards in here. And you should consider yourself very fortunate to be here. But you're going to do 4 projects to get your master's degree. But you have to collaborate with the planners and the landscape architects. Every project that you're going to be doing, you will go do it in collaboration with the planners. And there were 3 rooms in Robinson Hall of the corridor. We just kind of sneaked into each room. And we had absolutely no desire to collaborate with each other. But I tiptoed into landscape architecture because Ian McHarg, I decided, was the most handsome guy in the whole. And he was very outspoken. So I pushed my drawing in front of him and I said, Ian, I'd love to collaborate with you. And he said to me, when you're ready, and you tell me where you want the ficus tree or where you want Henry Moore's sculpture. And that was the end of their collaboration.
I have one question. I'm Ben Bolger. I did the MDesS in real estate and then a DDesS in real estate. And I'm just curious, some of you were talking about skills you learned, public presentation skills, architects, urban planners, other folks occasionally have to deal with the business world and potentially even make a profit as to what they do and pay some bills. And I'm just wondering, generationally, how well do you feel you were prepared to interact with business and actually, do something in terms of real estate? I know the GSD now is embracing more real estate, which is, I think, fantastic. But just wondering, generationally, what were those experiences like, and how well did you feel you were prepared?
Well, when I was here, we had Morty Zuckerman, who's done fairly well in real estate, teaching the real estate, finance course and for planners. And then we also had access to, I don't remember who it was, but there were 2 or 3 people at the business school who taught real estate, basically how to put together a pro forma, how to understand, how to put together deals, and so forth. And I think most of my colleagues did at least one of those courses. It's been very important to me, valuable to me, because we put together large urban development projects. And we need to understand, how the finances work and so forth. And so I think we were very well prepared. I think we had access to some of the best people in the country. And it was, but the fact that it was in the design school, it was designed for people who didn't have a B school background, I think was a real plus. And so I felt like we were fairly well prepared. It wasn't required, but a number, I took 2 of those courses. A number of my colleagues took at least one of them. Stevenson, yeah.
talking about collaboration, you have out there one of the boxes is about Ciudad Guayana. And that was a collaborative effort. You had Martin Meyerson, whom you mentioned. You had Bill Doble, whom you mentioned. You had Lloyd Rothwin from MIT. And I worked in that project, so I was fortunate enough to have that kind of experience. So there has been a lot of collaboration, and that was in 1962. And von Moltke, who was a planner, architect planner, was very collaborative, actually.
Thank you. So, yeah.
I can answer a quick your question just for the specifics of business and economics. During my time here, Tony Gomez Ibanez taught land economics, unbelievable clarity to us. You know, it was preceded we called it economics for dummies, you know, and we got it. I mean, he made that complex topic so clear. And then Charles Harris, for years, taught the joint studio with the business school, and Michael Horst came over from the business school, and I felt quite prepared to at least begin to understand the problem, be prepared.
Okay, well, I think this has been a nice discussion, and I'm glad we could hear such a variety of remarks. I think that now we have to have a break because at 4:30, where will right back here. So we have about 20 minutes for a break, and thank you very much for coming.